All right, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. The climate alarmist narrative is one that is underpinned by various groups with special interests. There's the politicians who use climate alarm to justify enhanced powers. There's businesses and firms that use climate alarm to pad their bottom lines. There's the activist types that use climate alarm to gain clout. And there are those that use climate alarm to justify an anti-humanist agenda. While all these groups help prop up the same climate narrative, they are all doing so for different reasons. And on this week's episode, we're going to be taking a look at that last group on the list, the anti-humanists. So join us as we talk about this topic and more on episode 454 of the In the Tank podcast. All right. Welcome to the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal. And today I've got a skeleton crew. It's just me and Justin Haskins, senior fellow for the Socialism Research Center here at the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
Well, yeah, I was, today was a little bit of a rough day, a little bit of a rough start. And then I came into the show here and there was nobody else here. Jim's gone. Chris is gone. Now I feel better. So
oh,
I don't know.
Fired.
I don't know I don't know if there's a correlation there, connection. I don't know, but things feel pretty good right now.
Yeah. And to even further elaborate on that, up until about an hour ago, I wasn't entirely sure whether or not you were going to show up. So I thought it was just going to be me flying solo. So at least I got a little backup, which is nice. So I appreciate that. Of course.
I thought I was half considering just not showing up, and then like 5-10 minutes in, just sort of popping in.
You pop in, I'm just like sweating. Everything's falling apart around me, and you come in and save the day.
I think you would have been fine. Look, Rush Limbaugh made a whole Hall of Fame career out of it. I think you could do it.
Well, the trick would be for all of these like professional broadcasters and people that make a living on the radio is that they're interrupted by commercials and traffic updates and weather updates like every 10 or 15 minutes. So they got it easy. So
well, that's all you have to do is just give weather updates. Just stop yourself, give some weather updates,
that's
fake
right.
commercials.
Oh, that's what I should do. That's what I should do. But I did prep like I was going on solo. So I have got a lot of stuff to talk about. I went deep down this rabbit hole of anti-humanism in preparation for this show. So everyone buckle up for this one. It's going to be one of those podcast episodes. We do some of these occasionally where you almost want to like bookmark it and save it because it's just going to be chock full of great information that you can reference a million times over. It's not going to go out of date. But yeah, you can almost like use this one as a resource. But before we get into any of that, I do want to mention to all those audio-only listeners that are probably catching the show on a Friday or later, leave a review for us on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. And also, you can consider joining us a day earlier on Thursdays at noon Central Time, where we are live streaming this on Facebook and YouTube and Rumble and X, and you can join the conversation. Throw your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we'll show your comment on the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. You can also help out the show by hitting that like button, sharing this content, subscribing if you haven't already, or just leaving a comment under the video. All those things help break through those big tech algorithms that prevent content like this from being shown to more people. And I would also mention the idea that we can do super chat functionality, but no, we've been demonetized. I mentioned this last week. We have been demonetized, so you're not going to be able to support our show that way, although we do have a new portal set up that if you want to support the show, you could just go to heartland.org/inthetank, and there is a specific donate to the Heartland Institute specifically for supporting In the Tank show. So we made that live last week. We've gotten a couple of donations through that, so I want a big thumbs up to those that stepped up to the plate and helped support the show that way. But YouTube and all of that, they're not going to help us out. So you need to help us out. So that's the situation that we're currently in. But like I said, we have got a lot to get into. Justin, anything that you want to discuss before I just like dive into the meat of this topic?
No, I think we should get going. There's a lot of really crazy things in the notes that you sent me, and I don't want to, I don't want. We never seem to get through all the notes. So today, maybe today's the day. Maybe today is finally the day. We've rid ourselves of the dead weight, and now it's just us. We can finally get through a show. So let's go and give it a real shot here.
All right.
So let's just get straight to it and see how far we can go.
Well, forgive me if I go on these little tangents here, because like I said, I went down a rabbit hole, and this is a very kind of holistic view of the anti-humanist kind of movement or whatever. I don't want to just pick all the low-hanging fruit. Like I wanted to kind of get into it. And like I said, went down a rabbit hole. So let's see where this conversation takes us. So the first thing that I want to mention right off the bat is just the concept of an intersubjective concept. Okay, so you'll see where I'm going with all of this, but I want to start off the conversation talking about this idea of an intersubjective concept. So this is basically the intersubjective concept is a subjective concept that's shared amongst a population. So this could apply to a whole bunch of things. It could apply to the idea of what a country is, or what a business is. The concept of Ford Motors vehicles as an entity is an example of like an intersubjective concept, right? So this is the idea that there's people's combined kind of knowledge of something kind of creates an entity that's not actually physically there. Like, what is Ford Motor vehicles? Like, is it the actual cars? Is it the factories? Is it the workers? Is it the stock price? It's arguably all of those things kind of put together. So this is an idea that's like something that's bolstered by the combined will of various populations. So these populations don't necessarily have to line up in the way that they kind of uphold this idea of an intersubjective concept. So like if we're talking about Ford, right? Like I mentioned Ford, the way that like a potential motorist looks at Ford might be completely different than the rubber manufacturer or an investor or an employee of Ford. They all have different ideas of what Ford is, but they all support this intersubjective concept of Ford. Climate change is also an intersubjective concept. Climate change, of course, is the idea that human action is driving a potentially catastrophic changes to the climate that will result in massive societal harm. Climate change as a concept is bolstered, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, by a vast array of special interests that all have certain agendas. Okay, you have the politicians that support the narrative because it justifies enhanced political power. You have industries that support the narrative because it could be used to pad their bottom lines. Think of the ESG scheme that we've been talking about on the show for years now. Activists and influencer types support the narrative because it can bring fame and clout. Media, bureaucrats, globalists, investment firms, banks. There are so many special interests that all have distinct as well as overlapping reasons to support the climate alarmist narrative. And the group and worldview that I want to discuss in length here on this episode is the anti-humanists. So I set this topic up this way for a couple of reasons. One is that I want to be as like nuanced on this topic as possible. I want to avoid all the accusations of like straw manning. I'm not accusing all of those that propagate the idea of climate change, and the climate change narrative as being anti-humanists. And two, I also want to dispel the idea that there's some type of widespread climate hoax conspiracy, that all of these people that I just mentioned are all in on this conspiracy. And I want to quote one of my favorite comedians, George Carlin, who famously once said, "You don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge." And that's what climate change is for all of these different groups that I outlined. It all has a convergence. So they're all supporting this thing for those own various reasons. And the anti-humanists are just one of those things. I'll circle back to all of this. There's another reason why I kind of wanted to set up all of this, but I'll get back to that. But before we go any further, and before I let Justin kind of enter the chat, I also want to define our terms. See, Justin, you could tell that I was planning on doing this solo. I've got a lot prepared here, so let's define our terms, right? So this is another instance where I want to be nuanced, and that is what the definition of anti-humanist is. So it would be way too easy for me to just kind of use anti-humanist to mean, people that just want to cull humanity for the sake of the planet. And there's plenty of those people, and we'll get to that, trust me. But the philosophy of anti-humanism is actually much broader than that. And looking at it through this broader lens, I think actually kind of helps us understand the larger impact of this corrosive worldview and all the ways that it, could be used. So anti-humanism is the philosophy that rejects the traditional human-centric worldview. It challenges the ideas of human reason, autonomy, and inherent goodness. It argues that these concepts are all socially constructed and serve to obscure how humanity really operates, which is through nothing more than natural selection and other environmental and social conditioning. So some of the primary positions of anti-humanists. Anti-humanists reject the idea that humans are inherently superior to other forms of life. Anti-humanists believe human behavior and identity are shaped by social structures and cultural practices exclusively, and not by any individual autonomy or innate qualities. So if you recall a while back, I did an episode where I talked about Yuval Harari and how his rejection of the concept of free will. This is an example of the sort of anti-humanist belief that I was just talking about. Flowing from that, anti-humanists believe power dynamics are exclusively derived from just chance developments. If someone has power and influence, they only got to that position because of just luck of the draw. They just happen to be molded in that position by a series of genetic and environmental conditioning. And this worldview then starts to flow into basic nihilism, where truth and ethics and morality are all just social constructs that have no inherent value or meaning, right? It's all just subjective. So that's kind of this would be a good part for you to jump in, Justin, kind of your thoughts of how I'm kind of laying this out, just at baseline, before we start getting into the specific details and how this relates to climate change. But any objections to kind of the way I'm setting up the foundation here?
No, I think this makes sense. I think too often we have a tendency to think of think about anti-humanism as the sort of like you said, the worst case scenario version of it. But in reality, there is a stream of anti-humanism, even a very mild form of it, that runs through almost all environmentalism, because sort of the whole concept of environmentalism is that humans harm the environment and should not always put themselves over and above the environment in every single case. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're anti-human per se in the worst case scenario of it, but I do think there's at least a hint of it, even in the most basic form of environmentalism. Because really, what an environmentalist is saying is that people shouldn't always put people first. That's essentially what that means, is that there are times when we should put nature first, because nature has more value than humans tend to give it. And then depending on how much value you want to give nature, you get increasingly more radical in your environmentalism, right? And in your solutions to the environmentalism, all the way up to not having people, not having many people or whatever. So I do think that is important to think of it that way. I think that makes sense. And we've seen this play out in public policy for, centuries. We've seen varying degrees of this, where you have And it doesn't always necessarily correlate very well. It's kind of funny how like some of the more anti-humanist governments, for example, are also not necessarily, or I should say, the governments that are not necessarily respectful of human life are also a lot of times the governments that don't care about the environment either.
Oh,
They
sure.
just don't care about anything, right? And so there is this weird kind of thing. But on the left, you see in America, the modern left, and really this goes back more than 100 years here in the United States. There's always been this sort of bent towards humans are causing too many problems. We can't just have like runaway growth, economic growth, societal growth, buildings, etc., people. We have to manage resources more carefully. And I guess you could argue that maybe they're suggesting there's a sort of even a wing of that's like they're doing it because they think in the long run humans won't survive unless we do these things, right? But then there are other people who just think nature has a higher value than humans. And so it is a massive tent of people who are to varying degrees not putting human welfare, prosperity, etc. as at the forefront of it. And I think all of that can be labeled to some degree at least anti-humanism. Even if it's just a little bit in some cases.
Yeah, I kind of want to address at least most of the points that I kind of outlined as like the positions of kind of that big tent, anti-humanist kind of movement or whatever. But let's start with the first one. So this is the idea that humans are not inherently superior to other forms of life. Some people might put like humans up here and itchy algae down here. But for some of the more hardcore anti-humanists, no, they're on the same level. Itchy algae has the same claim to life as, humans and all of that. And first off, before I go any like deeper into this, I do want to address that, and you kind of touched on this too when you were just talking there, Justin, that this position and like all the other positions, they all exist on a spectrum. This is not black and white. This is a lot of shades of gray. So on one end, you might just advocate for, forest preserves and national and state parks, and that's great. I think that most people are on that side. But as you slide down the spectrum, you have those that talk about humanity as like a planetary cancer that's just killing its host. Okay, so first I want to just kind of go through a little bit of a history, and there's some links in the show notes. We're running without a producer right now, so I'm not going to probably bring up many of the stories that I'm talking about, but there are links to them in the show notes. Whatever you're listening or watching this on, you should be able to go down and kind of see in the description and find the links to all the stuff that I'm talking about. So environmentalism, who knows how far back that goes? I mean, easily like the 1800s, but I'm sure there was at least one Egyptian guy that was like, really, people? Do we really have to leave our papyrus laying around? Like, there's a garbage can right there. So I don't know how far back environmentalism goes.
Well, and just like in like a real, just an interesting point just on that is, I mean, there have been religions like in ancient civilization essentially worship nature.
Oh, sure.
And so, I mean, you could say that is a form of environmentalism in a way, right? Sure. Like, obviously, if you think nature is your god, then you're going to treat it differently than you're going to treat people, right? So it's been around for thousands of years to varying degrees. Yeah.
So I have an article in the show notes that's published by the Mackinac Center, and they attribute the birth of modern-day environmentalism movement to the publishing of the 1962 book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So in this book, she makes the case that humanity represents an existential threat to nature. Carson wrote, quote, "The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born to the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man." And she goes on, further elaborates, just like the travesty of humans trying to control nature and all of that different stuff. So this book helped launch a movement in the environmental kind of wing that essentially pitted man as an enemy against nature. So downstream from all of this is like all of like the fears of resource depletion and rampant pollution and all of it, just poisoning the skies and everyone choking on smog, killing the planet, all of that sort of stuff. And this is what really kind of ushered in that whole idea of like human progress being seen as a blight to the planet. As the population grows, it moves into more areas, it cuts down more trees, it builds more houses, pollutes more, poisons the ground and water. Population unchecked metastasizes across the globe and eventually leads to a Mad Max post-apocalyptic future. Like that all pretty much stems from, at least according to this article, from this like 1962 Silent Spring book by Rachel Carson. And obviously, like I think a lot of people, even listening to this podcast, can be sympathetic to this fear. Like that idea of just like us just turning the planet into some like one giant city or something like that. Like I could see people being like, yeah, we shouldn't do that, right? But I'm like pretty staunchly, especially after doing a lot of this research, like I'm pretty staunchly a humanist. Okay, I'm a human supremacist, and I'm not nearly as fatalistic about like the future prospects of humanity. I think it's very possible that our future will look more like Star Trek as opposed to like the Hunger Games, So that's kind of where I come from. Like, I don't see this as like a zero-sum game in the same way that we talked about like socialism and capitalism or something like that, that like somebody's wealth is necessarily at somebody else's expense. I don't buy that. I think that, we can develop as a species so much that like the earth almost becomes secondary as we move out into the cosmos, like that sort of stuff. So that's kind of the worldview that I come from. But Justin, any comments on kind of this section before I move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is this bizarre ideology on the left, or there's bizarre framework that exists on the left when it comes to the environment, and this is true probably in a lot of other areas too, like economics and other things, but it's especially true in the environment, where they have an extremely linear way of looking at things. And what they do is they say, well, we're consuming X amount of water, and if we project this out over a long period of time, like we're running out of water. And sea levels are rising. We project this out over a long enough time, like every major city is underwater, and right. There's too many people. Like, this is one of the big things that happened. I don't know if we're going to get to this at some point, but the whole population boom thing, that was a huge, massive topic of concern, right, for a couple of decades in the United States, where they basically, you had these environmentalists in the 60s and 70s saying, like, there's so many people who are being added, like, just project this out, like we'll never be able to feed everybody, right? And they always make the same mistake. No matter how many times they're proven wrong, they continue to make the exact same mistake, which is that people figure out ways to solve problems. We don't all just sit here and watch as the cities get consumed by rising sea levels, assuming you even, believe sea levels are rising significantly. We don't just sit around and die from the heat. We create air conditioning, like we build buildings in a better way. We figure out we figure out solutions to problems, and they can be really hard problems related to our environment, and we do that. Actually, humans do that really well historically. That's one of the things that we have the best track record of doing, is figuring out ways to survive problems in the environment. That's like the biggest source of progress that we've had in humanity, and the left never seems to understand that. And so much of this doomsdayism is related to this idea that we can't really figure out a way. We're on this trajectory, this horrible trajectory, without this sense of like, no, actually there will be progress. We'll figure out really creative, innovative ways. I'm not worried that humanity 100 years from now is dumber than we are right now, and they won't figure out anything between now and then to feed more people. Like, they'll figure it out. And that's a lot of the reason I'm saying all this is because a lot of these problems, a lot of the anti-humanism problems, that's really the foundation of it, is they have just this no faith that humanity can figure out how to solve the problems that they see off into the future, because they don't know how to solve it. But
Right.
it's just no matter, they've been proven time and time again that it's just a completely wrong way of looking at things, and yet they keep falling into that trap. So what they want us to do is all suffer today and for decades into the future, so that we can avoid this problem off into the future that's supposedly unsolvable, when in reality there's never been an environmental problem that hasn't been solved. Like, eventually we've always solved these problems. And so that really is the root part of the problem, is there's a lack of optimism on the left about humanity. And I think that stems with a lot of the other stuff. And so I think there's a lot of people on our side of things who have your hopeful vision for, we'll figure it out. We're going to be living in this incredible era in the future, not this horrible, like dark ages, modern dark ages or something, where everybody is living in concrete cells and we're all dying because we can't feed ourselves anymore, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's I think climate change kind of offers a very like convenient cause to rally around for the anti-humanists, because you can kind of just like cloak yourself under this like, no, I love everything how it is. I just want it to be powered by wind and solar, like renewable resources. But everything else is great. Yeah, everything else is great. When in reality, I think like deeper down, especially on the anti-humanist level, and maybe even some of these like Greta Thunberg types, or if you just like drill down a little bit, you start to see like the true beliefs of these people. And this Justin, I'm going to reference your favorite reference of mine is like the first op-ed that I ever wrote. That's only a couple op-eds ago, but the first op-ed that I ever wrote back in like 2015. And it was based around this idea that eventually environmentalists will hate renewable energy. And this was all based around like the theoretical that I've kind of rejected ever since I wrote this article. This is based around the theoretical idea that like wind and solar would eventually increase efficiency so much so that it would be like the best power source out there, whatever. I don't believe that anymore. But if that were the case, then environmentalists would start to hate renewable energy. That was the basis of my of the op-ed. And it was most of that was supported by this development in the late 80s, when there was two scientists at some university in like Utah or something, where they announced that like, oh man, we just had a breakthrough. We just produced excess energy through the process of cold fusion. Like, this is going to be massive, everybody. We're going to have limitless, inexpensive, clean energy. This is groundbreaking. We're going to have free energy, essentially. Like, this is going to be amazing for everything, like forget climate change and CO2 emissions. Like, this is going to be amazing, right? And you would think that environmentalists or people that are super concerned about climate change, if that was really their primary concern, would have rallied behind this and be like, yes, a new era. Now we don't have to worry about, polluting the skies and all of that sort of thing. But the opposite happened. A lot of the big name environmentalists of that era came out and just trashed these scientists for supposedly coming up with cold fusion.
Right.
A couple of the examples I included in the article was Jeremy Rifkin, who was quoted by the LA Times as saying it's the worst thing that could happen to our planet. And he like started talking about how like this is just going to lead to a world that's just like unconstrained by anything. We're just going to fill the world with waste and use up all the world's resources and all of that. I think was it Paul Ehrlich? I think it was Paul Ehrlich who said that the idea of free energy is like giving an idiot child a machine gun, because in their worldview, the idea that like society should be limited by like lackluster, like let's be honest, lackluster energy sources like wind and solar. If we're just having to power society by wind and solar, our progress will be stunted. Our growth as a society will be stunted. So if you take out those roadblocks and replace it by some magical cold fusion free energy thing, then all of a sudden there's no roadblocks anymore. Society will just grow and grow and grow, and it'll just, like a cancer, take over the planet and destroy everything. That is the anti-humanist mindset when it comes to climate change right there. Comments on that, Justin? I got a few more examples of this.
No, keep going.
Okay. So, speeding up to today, okay, I've got another one on top of this, but speeding up to today, I just saw shared in one of our like Slack channels or whatever. There was an article that came out by the Daily Kos that was essentially a hit piece against Chris Talgo's recent article published in the Hill, where he talks about the issue that we've discussed on this podcast many times, the idea that the future of artificial intelligence and data centers and the increased digitalization of everything needs more reliable energy and can't sustain on wind and solar pipe dreams. Like it just can't do it. We've talked about this on the podcast. So what was the take by this author of the Daily Kos after reading Chris's article in the Hill? Well, it's explained in the headline. The headline is "The Right Wants to Sacrifice the Planet for Artificial Intelligence." That's what this guy was trying to claim. So he says that basically human innovation and development comes at the expense of the planet. Like this is this guy's mindset, and it should be stifled because of that threat, right? So if we're going to pursue artificial intelligence, but that's putting the planet in danger from the use of all of this, fossil fuels and everything, then artificial intelligence can be sidelined. And, say what you will about artificial intelligence. I'm just talking about this in the terms of human innovation. And the real tell, if you actually read this article, the real tell is that Chris's article also discussed the idea of using nuclear power to supply extra needed energy to support this, new developing industry of artificial intelligence. And the Daily Kos article completely ignores this. Why? Because then he wouldn't be able to use but reliable energy will destroy the planet line.
Right.
Chris gave him an out, gave these people an out. If we need more energy to support all these new developing things, it would be great if we could just take the boot off the neck of fossil fuels. But hey, maybe we could just do nuclear power like that. That'll supply some non-CO2 energy or whatever. And this Daily Kos article ignores that because it kind of flies in the face of this narrative. And the last thing I'll mention. Oh, go ahead.
No.
I got one more thing that I want to mention, but it's a little off topic.
Keep going. Oh, okay. Well, I think that is this theme is it's not theoretical and it's not even recent. I mean, you go back in time and you look at all the modern left, the progressive left in the United States and the socialistic left in the United States have been making dire environmental arguments well before they were concerned about climate change. They've been doing this forever, and the solutions, no matter what the problem is always the same. It's always very similar solutions to these constantly evolving problems. And that, when you see that over a long enough period of time, so when you see in the 1970s global cooling is the crisis, and there's only one solution, and it's more government interaction, more government power, more limits on our energy consumption and pollution, because they believed that pollution was what was causing this global cooling. That was the theory at the time, one of the theories. The population boom and all the issues that are related to the population boom, the ozone layer thing, there's been a million of these things. The idea, the whole concept of Silent Spring, which you referenced earlier, was that humans would so pollute the earth that you would eventually have a spring that is silent, like you won't hear the animals and that sort of thing, right? And so it's like this concept has always existed, no matter what the problems are. And even when these problems get resolved, and we aren't worried about the ozone layer, we aren't worried about rivers being polluted, we aren't worried about these things that we used to be worried about to the degree that we were in the past. Have they stopped making like the same radical demands? No. Like they keep making the same radical demands over and over and over again. And at some point you say, well, either it's one of two things. Either they don't actually care about any of these arguments, and they're just looking for a reason to justify more government power. And I think in some cases that's definitely true. Or they're just looking for an excuse to get votes, or they're just looking for a way to fearmonger, something like that. Or their real ideological environmental view is much more radical than any of these things. And I think that it's crazy to think, and this is often how these people are presented, that like if we just had wind and solar everywhere, like then we would just all go home. Like you'd never hear from us ever again.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, of course that's it. Like that, they make it sound like that's the only thing they want. Like we're just trying to save the planet from global, catastrophe, and then we'll get out of everyone's way. It's like, no, you won't. We know you won't, because before this crisis, you guys were still here making different accusations. And
Right.
even if you so-called solved this problem, you would have a whole set of new problems that you want, environmental problems that need more government programs and all of this stuff. It's like you and I used to mock like this whole Bernie Sanders thing, where like when Bernie Sanders was kind of at his height recently of popularity, and he was almost became the Democratic nominee for president. And it was like, all he wants is a $15 minimum wage and single payer healthcare. That's it. And every country in the world other than us has single payer healthcare. And so, of course, we should have single payer healthcare and $15 minimum wage. That's it. And it's like, no, it isn't. Like,
Right.
no, it isn't. And his campaign, we couldn't even get through one campaign season when the $15 minimum wage, there were then people saying, well, it should be 20 or 25 or whatever. And then it's just going up and up and up. And single payer healthcare is obviously not where it stops, because he's a socialist. The long-term goal is something much bigger than all of this stuff. And with environmentalism, there is a strain of the environmental movement where it's like, they are true believers. They aren't doing this just because they want power and wealth and or votes or something like that. They're doing it because they do have a bigger sort of utopian idea, but they can't say that out loud usually, because no one's going to be on board with that. So what they do is they pick an issue and they focus on it, and they make it seem like this is all they're about. It's just about global cooling. It's just about the ozone layer. It's just about saving the sea otters. Like, that's all it is. It's nothing else. And then you realize one day, when you listen very, very carefully, when you actually start digging into it and reading what they say to each other behind the scenes, and you start to read things that say much more radical things than this, and you realize this really is not what this is about. This actually has really nothing to do with, in the long grand scheme of things, climate change. It's just a pit stop on a much longer road that ends in a place that, if they just started with that place and they're like, you know what we should do? We should have this world over here, the one we want. Everyone would be like, oh my God, you guys are insane. And so they did try to do this other thing to get us there. And that is like the red pill moment for a lot of people who actually take the time to look at it. Is you might be a person who's worried about climate change or whatever, but then once you actually start seeing what the long-term vision is for these people, you realize, whoa, like this is not at all what I signed up for.
Yeah, I know that this is a little bit of a tangent, but it just, some of the things you're saying reminds me of this when we are doing like our work on socialism, and there was that idea that like all these socialist thought, this Marxist thought, communist thought, whatever, was based around this idea that if we keep pursuing this like capitalist system, that people are going to get more and more exploited, their wages are going to continue to get down. It's just going to continue to get like a worse class gap and all of that stuff, to a point where just like the workers are just being marched on top of, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then there was a I forget his name, but there was like a socialist historian or whatever that noted that like as whatever the 20th century progressed, we saw that there was actually the opposite was happening, and that people's wages were getting better, and there was a growing middle class, and all of this stuff and all these fears that were propagated under this idea of like the continued exploitation of the workers just kind of like vanished and went away. So what do they have to do? Instead of suggesting that like capitalism was just going to be destroying the working class, they had to morph that and change it into, well, if we keep doing this capitalist system, it's going to destroy the planet. There we go. We still need all the same stuff that we were advocating for, but just justified by a different thing. So yeah, that just reminded me of that. But one other example of just this this kind of environmentalist disdain for nuclear power was something I had mentioned on this podcast a million times, but I know that I mentioned it a couple of episodes ago. And this is the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is one of the largest kind of environmental organizations out there. And they've had long-standing opposition. Their viewpoint has been long-standing opposition to nuclear power. And one of their things, I remember going back, like this is years ago, going to the Sierra Club website and looking up what their position on nuclear power was. And up until 2016, when they changed it, but up until 2016, it says that the Sierra Club opposed the licensing, construction, and operation of new nuclear reactors utilizing the fission process. It went on saying that they will continue opposition pending, quote, development of adequate national and global policies to curb energy overuse and unnecessary economic growth.
Yep.
So those two things are just like the complete giveaway with all of this. Yep. Energy overuse and unnecessary economic growth. Because if you were to talk to any of just like any politician that's out there talking about climate change, from Bernie Sanders to AOC, Joe Biden, anybody, all of them are going to just paint this idea that, well, if we just shift to wind and solar and everyone gets electric cars or whatever, society is just going to be thriving and we're going to be able to do it cleanly or whatever. And this just shows that if we did do that, the places like the Sierra Club, which I think the last time I saw, they had like a yearly budget of like $100 million or something like that.
Right.
They would still be staunchly against it because of this environmentalist, anti-humanist concept that humanity is just a plague on the earth, and that without anything stopping it, it would just metastasize and destroy the planet. So
yeah, well,
that's the anti-humanist thing when it comes
and
to
honestly, you and I have, so there's a lot of people out there in the world who don't really know the downsides to wind and solar and all of that. They don't understand it really. Electric cars, all that stuff. But people who've actually looked into it though, and they know the cost issues, they know the infrastructure issues, they know that more important than even that, all these issues are based on like a tiny fraction of the electric grid running on this energy right now, and not having a lot of electric cars in the marketplace right now. That when you scale all these things up, these problems become like essentially impossible to solve. And people like us who have actually looked at those things know that's the situation. You're never going to be able to actually grow the economy on a wind and solar based energy system. It's literally impossible. Like it can't be done. And so you have to ask yourself, the Sierra Club type people and the big name politicians who are pushing for this stuff, like they know that. They've heard these arguments. They're well aware of this. It's not like no one's ever told them, hey, if we scaled this stuff up, like it would be impossible for us to do this. And the amount of mining that we would have to do all over the world to get the resources to run like this isn't going to work. They know that. So why are they still advocating, especially when you start projecting out greater energy consumption over a longer period of time? Because again, you have to account for the fact that our societies, generally speaking, are becoming more technology focused. There are huge parts of the world with billions of people in it that still are not really very well developed. And they're not watching television and have air conditioning and live in a modern world, but someday they probably will. And so what happens to the world when all of India has air conditioning? Like, what does that world look like in terms of energy consumption, right? Like, it's going to be a completely different world, right? So they know all this. So then why are they still advocating for something that they know can never work? And you could make an argument that some of them are doing it just for expediency. Some of them are doing it for political or ideological reasons related to more government involved in your life and bigger government programs and stuff like that. Sure. But I think that on the environmental side, like these Sierra Club types, I think the reason that they're advocating for it is because it almost guarantees that our current energy consumption, it's like a ceiling. It's like an automatic ceiling on energy consumption, because we already can't match current energy consumption just using wind and solar in a realistic way. Like that just isn't possible around the world. And then when you scale these things up and you say what happens when India has air conditioning, like everywhere in India, every house in India has air conditioning, like, well, then what? Well, they know that can't be solved. So when it's essentially an unofficial ceiling on the amount of energy that you will ever be able to produce, the amount of expansion that humans will ever be able to have, the amount of buildings and all this stuff that you can run on electricity, and like all of this stuff, because it is literally impossible to scale this up for a world that will likely exist 200 years from now. Like it's just not possible. So how do you but if you were to adopt the model of, no, what we need to do is find a different form of energy that's clean and is really cheap and widely available, like a cold fusion type thing, or leaning more into nuclear energy or something like that, well, then, all these other things that they're saying suddenly become they can't control it anymore.
Exactly.
Like the ceiling is gone forever.
Exactly right.
And they need the ceiling. They want the ceiling because most people do not agree with them that we should create that we should create a cap on human prosperity, growth, expansion, etc. They want the environment. They want, most people in the modern, in the really high developed countries like in Europe and Canada and America, like, people care about the environment. They want the environment to be like a good place. They don't want pollution everywhere and all of that. But they also want humans to be really wealthy and prosperous and have really comfortable lives, and everybody is as healthy as possible and living as long as possible and all of that. And those goals don't fit with the really far left-wing environmental goals. So let's lock in an energy system that can't ever get those goals. And then we can just blame it on, well, it's just not possible. It's not feasible. There's just no way to do it. And now you've got this whole system in place where you've built out this massive, failing, terrible infrastructure. We're going to tear it all down so we can move to nuclear? Like, they're going to say that, oh, we can't. They'll have a reason for why we can't do that. I really do think there is a stream of them that have thought this all the way out to this point and have come up with this idea. I really do, because it doesn't make sense in any other way.
Yeah. Suddenly the environmentalists all of a sudden start caring about what is it, like the juniper plants or whatever that are like torn up in the desert to put up new solar panels, or they suddenly start caring about the birds that are getting like whacked out of the skies by wind turbines. They didn't care. They were very quiet when they were developing all of this stuff and making sure that the support of politicians mandating all of this stuff. But then once we would actually get that in place, suddenly they would care about it. And then you would see that ceiling that you're describing would start probably coming down after that. But so another reason that I brought up the idea of like an intersubjective concept is because while there's varying different groups that have different reasons for supporting this, because they're all supporting the same narrative, you see a bleed over in some of the rhetoric and all of that. And suddenly you start seeing politicians or people in positions of power that are using the talking points of the anti-humanists. And this is where it gets really dangerous, right? So Justin, you mentioned the population control stuff already earlier in the podcast. We did an entire episode on this. I think it was episode 407. That's another one of these episodes that you almost want to like bookmark because it's just so full of information. I remember doing a lot of homework for that episode 407. We did a whole section on the eugenics movement of like the 50s and the 60s. We talked about Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, that spurred a lot of this, fretting over growth in population, how it's going to lead to us running out of food and mass starvation and all of that sort of thing. I remember we went through China's one-child policy of like the 80s and 90s and to a lesser degree going into today. An idea, by the way, that was endorsed by many, or at least some, environmentalists, including Paul Ehrlich, who as late as 2015 lamented China trying to move away from this barbaric practice. So this isn't just like, oh yeah, back in the 80s we were for it, but now we're enlightened. No, Paul Ehrlich, 2015, was upset that China was moving away from its one-child policy. I remember we talked about the more contemporary zero population growth movement. So there's a whole lot of different attempts at ushering in population control. There was that one study, I didn't put it in my notes, but I'm surprised I didn't, because this is one that I always go back to. But it was a study just from a handful of years ago where they outlined the spectrum of coercion in terms of public policy of what you could do if you wanted to pursue population control, starting from just like providing access to healthcare options. And I put quotes around that because they just mean abortion. And then beyond that, like trying to just indoctrinate people through like media and rhetoric and just like billboards that show happy families with one kid, that sort of stuff. And then moving beyond that, incentivizing people through the tax code to incentivize having less kids or disincentivize having many kids. And then the furthest part of that spectrum, which they said that they did not condone, was the idea of just like straight up population control, like in China. And so that's not an old report either. That's just a couple of years old. And then even newer than that was this letter that went around. This is several years ago. That was signed by 10,000 different scientists or something that was all calling for the declaration of a climate emergency. This got like a ton of headlines, I remember, saying like 10,000 scientists are encouraging, climate, catastrophe or something like that, right? But if you actually went and read the letter, you see that there's some very troubling things in there. Under one section that was just labeled population, it says that still increasing by roughly 80 million people per year, or more than 200,000 people per day, the world's population must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced within a framework that ensures social integrity. So this big letter that got all those headlines has some population control language in it. I've seen a couple of comments in here. I'm not going to be able to comb back for them, but some of them talking about certain people calling for different ideal populations for the world. I remember playing on this show several weeks ago. What's the lady? Jane Goodall, that was saying like the ideal population is like 500 million. Sterling's in the chat. He's the host of the climate, or he's a panelist in the Climate Realist show that takes place on every Friday at noon, Heartland's channel. But he mentioned a couple of different people, environmentalists, that set the ideal target at like 200 million or 1 billion or something like that. So there's a lot of people out there that think that the world is already far too populated and that needs to be reduced. So Justin, I mean, I don't want to like kind of rehash all of this, but we can't have an episode about anti-humanism and climate change without addressing that there historically has been lots of calls for population control. And more contemporary, there still are calls for it. I mean, even AOC talked about how like she is totally sympathetic to people that are questioning whether or not they should have kids nowadays because of the threat of climate change destroying our planet. Right. So any further thoughts on the idea of population control?
Well, I mean, this is like this idea is playing out on a timeline that we're in the midst of it, and it still sounds like a crazy idea to people in the West, even though in other parts of the world they have done this. You talked about the one-child policy, the two-child policy in China and stuff like that. So this has already been instituted at times in other parts of the world. But here in the West, we think of this as just this inconceivable thing that this would ever be something that could be fully adopted, even though there are people in the West right now. Like you said, Jane Goodall, she's not from China. She's from the Western world, and she has adopted this. There are other people, David Attenborough and stuff like that, who have said, that they adopt at least some conception of this. And it always starts as like, this is the way everything on the left works. It always starts as like a suggestion, like, we should do this. And then it becomes like, we should advocate for it. And then we should, incentivize it. And then, eventually it's just when people aren't doing it, it just becomes a full blown, a mandate. And we have to, because if we don't, then what's the consequences of that, right? And you can see that in almost every environmental cause that we've had in the last 50, 60 plus years. It's always gone that way. Like climate change started out that way, right? It started out as like, well, people should just find ways to use less electricity and drive your car less and bike more. And now it's like full blown, we're just going to debank you and ruin your business and your life if you don't start making the transition by by 2030 or 40 or 50 or whichever one whoever, depending on who you're talking to a full-blown net zero economy, because we don't have the luxury of waiting. We're all gonna die, and it's like that is true of almost even the small issues, like don't use so much plastic, and then let's have a tax on plastic bags, and then let's just ban plastic bags. Like This is how it always goes, because what they realize is at some point, and they may know it up front, but they just know they can't start with the authoritarian stuff, but at some point what ends up happening is the vast majority of people, it becomes apparent that the vast majority of people do not agree with these radical environmental views. Even if they pay lip service to them sometimes, they don't actually agree with them. They're not willing to change their lives. They're not willing to stop driving their cars. They're not willing to make these gigantic sacrifices. They're not willing to do, as Greta Thunberg has done, get on a boat and take a boat across the ocean because I don't like plane travel's bad. Like, people aren't willing to do that. So, and so at some point, the only option is you either give up and throw your hands up in the air and say, well, I tried, and you go home, which is kind of how free pro-liberty people handle things. Like we often do end up doing that with a lot of stuff. We're like, well, I guess no one's going to listen to us. So, oh, well, like, what can we do? But this on the left, that's never how it ends. It always ends with, we're going to crack the whip. We're going to slam down the hammer. We're going to make sure that people do these things. And you end up with some kind of authoritarianism. And when you're talking about humanity, and you're talking about population control, and you're talking about having too many people, too many mouths to feed, too many of this, like, that is a huge, huge problem. And then last point on that, though, is that historically, America, that used to be like a common thing. Like, we're talking about this right now as though this is like a oh, well, we're progressing and eventually we're going to get there, potentially. Like, that seems to be the trajectory we're on. And I think that's true. But if you go back in time to like the early progressive era, like the early 1900s, that period of time, they were openly calling for eugenics, openly calling for population control, openly calling for killing the quote unquote useless eaters and the disabled, the mentally handicapped. Like, that was all out in the open. And then the Nazis happened, and it became politically very bad to align yourself with those kinds of views. And so suddenly the progressive left like started changing their tone on all of that stuff after decades. And I'm not talking about in Europe. I'm talking about in America. Like in America, we were openly advocating for all those policies on the left. And so this is not like this, well, this could never happen here. It has happened here. They just stopped for a while. They took a break, and now they're working their way back up to a frenzy again. And it's not at all surprising if we circle back around to the same crazy ideas that they had 100 years ago. It really wouldn't be that strange.
Oh yeah, no doubt. But this is the part. So when I was doing the research, this is like the rabbit hole that I was kind of talking about earlier in the episode. Because when I was doing the research for all this, and I was laying out all my notes, and I was really spending a lot of time kind of like looking at that kind of anti-humanist positions, right? Because I didn't want to straw man it, whatever, right? That this connection really kind of clicked for me, and I think you're right. The idea that what first starts as like, oh yeah, maybe you should consider this, to man, we're going to incentivize this, to we're going to force this. That is definitely historically kind of the way that authoritarian regimes go. That's kind of the pattern for all of this. But I think that what we're facing now is slightly different. I think in essence, it's exactly that. But I think what we're facing now is slightly different, because even with like the population control stuff, some of the other stuff that we've talked about, environmental, whatever stuff that we've talked about, especially like in China, whatever, it all still kind of adhered to this idea that, the government is going to set some rules. And if you break those rules, you're going to be punished. Okay. And this is kind of like a recognition that like people have agency, they have autonomy, they have like they know what they're doing when they're making the choices. Therefore, they're making a choice whether or not to break those rules or not break those rules and be punished for breaking those rules or not, right? And I think what we're seeing now is a shift towards more social engineering as opposed to just like the heavy hand of government. And I think that this is all wrapped up into those kind of anti-humanist ideas that there is no autonomy, there is no agency. Everyone is just a result of just the genetics and cultural upbringing and all of that, and they're not actually exercising free will. So therefore, you can't really be punished for doing something that you're predestined to do anyways. So what the people in power are doing is, like I said, shifting to that idea of social engineering. If people can't actually make the choice of whether or not they're breaking the rules, then we'll just craft society where it just guides them around certain things that we want them to go around. We're not going to just straight up punish them for it. We're just going to craft the systems where they have to do it, whether they want to or not. And basically all the things that we've been talking about in regards to kind of the emerging issues that we keep track of at the Socialism Research Center all kind of conform to this idea. And this is like the ESG, right? This is just like, we're going to craft this system so that you have to play by these rules in order to succeed or not, right? You're not necessarily being punished by some mandate. It's just the rules that if you're not, being green or socially conscious or whatever, you're just going to, fail compared to the people that are adhering to those rules. 15-minute cities. That's like another example of this. We're just going to craft your landscape so that you have to adhere to this more environmentally protective version of reality that we're trying to put together. CBDCs is another one of those, where it's just we're just setting up the playbook so that people just have to operate under the worldview that we're constructing. And we know, Justin, you've already talked about this, but we know the worldview that they're trying to construct. We've talked about the C40 cities plan, and their outlined ambitious targets that drastically reduce people's consumption of meat or buying clothes or buying new electronics or owning cars or traveling by plane. But what is more effective, I think the kind of the powers that be types are learning this. What's more effective isn't just punishing people for taking an extra plane flight or something. It's just wrapping them up in a system that's governed by CBDCs and 15-minute cities and ESG, where they don't even have the option to break those rules anyways. So it's this whole giant social engineered structure that they're trying to create that I think goes completely hand in hand with that anti-humanist concepts that I laid out at the very beginning of this podcast. This is the mindset that ties directly into the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, the Yuval Harari, the threat of digital dictatorships, and the control that could be ushered in using fourth industrial revolution technologies. I think that is the realm that we've moved into, and it is overwhelmingly a mindset that correlates very strongly with anti-humanist perspective. So that's kind of the grand vision that I had for this podcast, is kind of laying all of that out. Once it clicked last night when I was putting my notes together, I was just like, oh yeah, this is something right here. So Justin, are you following me? Did I lose you? What are your thoughts on that?
I think this makes sense. And I think that the safeguard in the United States was always that you had a fundamentally pro-human constitutional framework that was a safeguard against government actions going too far, trying to be too manipulative of people for whatever reason. That's why, you have the Bill of Rights, the whole constitutional system we have in the United States is set up to protect individuals from a centralized national government coming in and imposing its will on people, or even silencing them, or imprisoning them unjustly, or threatening them. And in some, all of it is designed for that purpose, right? And so the social engineering, I think ideally what the left would do is they would just impose a lot of this very directly in a very authoritarian way through the government. But our government system is not set up to pass laws easily, number one. So it's really hard for them to pass anything. But then on top of it, they have to get through this constitution, which is very pro-human and puts the individual at the center, protecting the individual's rights over and above the good of the collective and all this other stuff. And so the ESG way of dealing with things is the end run around that protection.
Exactly
we
right.
have to socially engineer, not through the government, but not only because this isn't working, through the government, because we're not even getting the laws we want passed that are mild versions of what we really want. But in addition to that, we eventually we're going to run into this roadblock of the Bill of Rights and stuff like that. So we have to figure out a way to engineer society around that. And you and I talked for a long time about how this is why modern monetary theory and the endless printing of money and the massive amounts of government money that's coming into the system, why it matters so much. Because how do you get the private businesses to socially engineer on your behalf? You got to buy them off, because they're businesses after all. They're going to chase the dollar. So if you control the dollar, you can get them to do anything you want. And of course, if your dollars are coming from taxpayers, well, now you've got another roadblock. You've got these stupid taxpayers who are going to come in and say, no more taxes. I've been taxed enough already, right? Like that whole Tea Party thing. So what do they have to do? They have to come up with a way to come up with dollars without having to take it from taxpayers, more of it from taxpayers. And that's what the endless money printing thing has become. It's a way of, it's all part of the same machine. And what's really interesting, we talked about this recently on another episode, is even this is not working as well as they wanted, right? They're doing this social engineering thing, and they're doing it through ESG, but now there's all this pushback on ESG. And there's all this pushback from consumers saying, we don't like that every time I go to Target, it's like walking into a Democratic Party convention. I don't like that. I want to change things, right? And so there's this pushback. The social engineering isn't going as smoothly as they wanted through this ESG system. So what do? Because you can't just pass the laws. They've tried that. You can't have this ESG system as the sole mechanism through doing this without running into all these headaches. So what's the solution? Well, what would be really convenient is if some foreign government somewhere out in the world started imposing the social engineering metrics on these businesses, who then impose them on everybody else. And now it doesn't even matter what people in America think anymore. And that's exactly what's going on in Europe. That's what the European Union mandated ESG system is. It's another end run around market forces in America. Now market forces don't even matter as it pertains to ESG. So it is constantly what the progressive system or the progressive ideology is. We are constantly stumbling around seeking for this way of socially engineering, and we're running into roadblocks all the time, and we just got to we don't ever give up. That's not how progressives operate. You just keep figuring out ways around the system. And depending on what era you're in, they either just change the rules so that the system works for them. They amass enough government power that they're able to ram these things through, which should be considered illegal, or there's a crisis big enough that people are willing to suspend their liberty in order to give power to these, crazy progressives. Or they manipulate the market through ESG and money printing, or they allow foreign governments to essentially control them in order to accomplish some progressive goal, on and on and on and on and on. There is always this endless attempt to get to this social engineering utopia that they're after. And what people need to remember is, fundamentally, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with some of their goals or whatever, you think that maybe you are concerned about climate change, you are concerned about the environment, whatever. The most important thing is this: fundamentally, none of this would be necessary if most people wanted what they want, because we would all just do it voluntarily. The only reason you have to have social engineering and coercion is because most people in a democratic republic The only reason you have to do that is because most people don't want what they want. And so the very essence of all of this is we need to control the masses who are not doing what we want them to do. It is fundamentally in opposition to what the regular person wants. That's the soul, and every person should be offended by it. They should be offended by it. Like when you think about ESG and you think about progressivism, these are offensive concepts. What they're saying is you people, you dumb people in society won't just buy the right products and services. You won't just do or say the right things. You won't just censor your ideas on your own. So we have to figure out all these complicated ways to censor you, but you got that stupid constitution, so we can't just ram it through government. So instead, we got to come up with all these elaborate ways of doing it outside of that system. And instead of being offended, like half the country is like, yeah, we should be doing that. And it's like, don't you realize they're talking about you too? That we're, it's only a tiny fraction of society that really believes in all of these progressive goals all the way to their logical ends. It's incredible that we're not all just outraged by the very notion of social engineering. And yet that is that is exactly where we should be, and hopefully someday will be. And that's the whole purpose of this organization and shows like this. It's to shed light on what's going on, to really discover these plans that are going on constantly behind the scenes that most people have no idea about. And that's really the only way that people can push back against it, is if they know what's going on. Otherwise, they're going to get away with it. And they almost have on ESG and a whole bunch of other things, if it weren't for shows like this, if it weren't for organizations like the Heartland Institute.
Very well said, Justin. And yeah, I mean, that's once I started putting the research together on this and getting my notes together and really looking into kind of the anti-humanist thing. And that's why I really made a focus at the beginning of the episode to say that I was going to look at it as broadly as a philosophy as possible. And I'm glad I did that, because it really, to me, just gave insight into just everything that we've been talking about on this show for the last multiple years, that it all ties into this anti-humanist kind of perspective of things. And that was very eye-opening to me. I think kind of reducing it down to just they want to reduce the population doesn't do it justice. It's way bigger, and it's way more insidious than that. So, Justin, unless you have anything that you want to say, anything you want to get off your chest, I'm going to wrap it up here for this week's episode.
I'm good.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all for tuning into this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Join us every week for a new episode. Audio-only listeners that are probably catching the show on a Friday or later, leave a review for us on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. You could also join us a day earlier on Thursdays at noon Central Time, where we are live streaming this on Facebook and YouTube and X and Rumble, and you can join the conversation. Throw your comments and questions in the chat. Maybe we'll show your comments on the screen. Maybe we will, address your questions on the fly. And if you would like to support the show, you can financially by going to heartland.org/inthetank, where you can support the show directly. Or you could help us out by not spending $1, just by spending a couple of seconds, hitting that like button, sharing this content, subscribing if you haven't already, or just leaving a comment under the video. All those things help break through those big tech algorithms and prevent content like this from being shown to more people. If you'd like, you can follow us on X at In the Tank Pod, or you can send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to the show by emailing us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on X. That's the primary way. And of course, go to stoppingsocialism.com if you want to learn about the history of socialism, some of the best arguments about socialism, and heartland.org, of course, always a good place to go for all things Heartland Institute.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. Join us next week. Have a good one. Forgot the outro video, everybody.
He's a lion, dog, big pony soldier.